Hello everyone, welcome to this presentation. My name is Laurent Bugnion and I work for Microsoft Azure. I'm very happy to welcome you to this keynote today, to DevOps stage. We are going to talk about Azure and some of the services and features that we have. And I know firsthand how overwhelming it can be because I've been there. 4 years ago when I started working for Microsoft, I didn't know anything much about Azure, and maybe I had started a virtual machine before, but really it was quite overwhelming. And when you are in front of something so big, it can be a little bit scary. And so hopefully this presentation will remove some of the fears. And if some of you go after the presentation and try things on your own, I would be really happy, and hopefully this will happen. So let's take a look at the agenda. So today we are going to talk about, first of all, a small introduction to Azure, what is Azure, etc. And then we will also talk about, if you want, the different layers of services that we have. And maybe you have heard those terms before, things like IaaS, Infrastructure as a Service, PaaS, Platform as a Service. And then we'll also have things like serverless applications, functions, and logic apps, etc. And also, of course, a lot of demos. I love demos, and hopefully you will like them as well, where I will take you on a tour through some of the services and show you some of the features we have. So Azure is very large. We have 60 plus regions. And why do we say 60 plus regions? Is because honestly, at this point, I lost count a little bit. I was, in the early days, I used to say, all right, we have 54 regions. Oh, suddenly we have 56 regions. Well, now it's really too much. And if you want to take a look at those regions and see an interesting view of what we have, you can also go to this view. This is infrastructuremap.microsoft.com, and this is a view of the globe where you see some of the infrastructures that we have. Obviously, North America has quite a lot, but also here is South America, we have Africa, we have here Europe, and of course Asia. And also on this website you will see a lot of information about the Microsoft Azure infrastructure in general. So take a look at that. This is always interesting to see where we are and what we do. So if you have never been into a data center, this is more or less how it looks like. All right, you have a lot of lights, a lot of cables, like kilometers and kilometers and hundreds and thousands of kilometers of cables. Why would you even go into a data center like that? Well, there are really multiple reasons. First of all, we'll talk about that later. Things like automatically scaling your application or automatically taking care of some features of your application, which can be very interesting. But there are also some features in terms of security, because most of the time there is literally nobody on the floor of a data center. Here we see one person going through, but that's very rare. Most of the time everything is automated, and so nobody is going to break in and take things that belong to you, right? This is quite a nice advantage. Of course, software security as well, software innovation, right? You always get the latest installation, for example, of .NET. I'm a .NET developer, so I'm very interested into that, but also other things like, for example, Java, etc. Also around, the environment, right? That can be interesting. Those data centers obviously use a lot of electricity, but we also partner with government to use reusable energy to compensate the carbon, to offset the carbon that we are using, etc. And in fact, there are also some interesting experiments happening. For example, this is here a data center that spent a couple of years under the sea, and it's interesting to see what kind of life starts getting on top of those containers, which is why we need to clean them up when we take them out. But it was an interesting experiment where we were running those data centers in a totally independent manner under the sea for a while. Why do I love Azure? What do I love about Azure? It's really the ability that it gives me to experiment. Okay, there is a principle in design where you can sketch something quickly on a napkin or on paper and then kind of throw it away as fast as possible because you don't want to get attached to your design. In software, it's a little bit the same, right? You don't want to get too attached to your applications because you can always incrementally improve your applications. And on Azure, you can do that because you can allocate some resources, but then you can also very fast, recycle those resources. So it allows you to experiment and to innovate very fast. When you work in the cloud, you will hear some terms such as IaaS and PaaS and SaaS and sometimes FaaS. And software developers love jargon, they love abbreviations, and because it kind of makes us feel almighty, or I don't know exactly why, but this is kind of annoying. So let's review a little bit what's going on with those terms and what they mean. So first of all, IaaS, very often we understand virtual machines under that. So essentially it's a computer which is running in the cloud, all right? And then you connect to it just like you would connect to another computer that maybe you have at home using a remote desktop, using SSH or using other things. Now, virtual machines are very often where people get started at first because it's easy. Right? It's easy to understand, right? I have a full-blown computer somewhere, it's on a network, I can access it via, for example, remote desktop. And this is really cool. So it's also an easy path to the cloud because you can take your application as is and kind of lift and shift it, okay? This is what we say, we migrate, we lift the application and we shift it into the cloud without changing anything. But of course, it's also not very efficient because around the VM, you're going to have to take care of everything else, right? The network, the disk, the security. You have to patch your operating system. You have to install antivirus software, etc., etc. So it's quite complex, but it's very often a first step into the cloud, and it's very valid in that regard. Then the next step is platform as a service, PaaS. And here we talk about things like, for example, app services. This is a web server in the cloud. So instead of having to worry about the whole server, you just worry about, the configuration of the server, certainly, and what is running on it, which is your application. Or maybe things like SQL Server, Azure SQL Database in the cloud, all right? So here too, you don't have to worry about the operating system of the virtual machine that is hosting this SQL Server. You just worry about your data. Or Azure Cosmos DB, which is a NoSQL database. And we also have well-known open source databases that, for example, MySQL, etc., or Postgres, which run in the cloud as a service. So again, platform as a service. And then the next step would be software as a service. And here we are talking about something that you probably used already at some point. For example, Microsoft Excel online, all right, in the web. So you know that if you get a link, you can open it and then you have a full-blown spreadsheet in the web. And basically, you can use that and you can edit your documents and you can even collaborate, like multiple people at the same time collaborating on the same document. There are, of course, tons of other SaaS, software as a service alternatives. For us as developers, we most of the time deal with IaaS, PaaS, and there is also another thing that we deal with, which is, of course, serverless applications. Serverless, it's a kind of a fancy word. There is actually a server, but we say, okay, it's not serverless, it's actually less server. Here, you just publish your code to, in that case, Microsoft Azure, for example, as an Azure function, and then it's just going to start running. That's as easy as that. When it's not used, it stops, so it's also efficient. We'll talk a little bit more about functions a little bit later. And we also have some low-code or no-code solutions, for example, Power Apps, or on Azure we have something which is called Logic Apps, and Logic Apps, I really like them very much because they allow me to very, very fast achieve something. It's like a workflow. I'll show you a demo a little bit later, where without having to worry about authentication, without having to worry about complex code, maintaining my code, I can very easily create a workflow, trigger that workflow, and basically when it's not running, I don't pay for it at all, so it's very, very convenient. All those applications have some free tiers so that you can experiment as a developer. You can also create a free Azure account where you get some credits upfront so that you can try things out. And then after that, of course, it's like everything on the web, it is a pay-on-demand model where you pay for what you consume, all right? So a different type of economy than traditional servers. So without further ado, let's go into the meat of this presentation. Let's talk about those different layers. And we are going to start with virtual machines. What are virtual machines? They are essentially, like I said before, a computer running in the cloud. And of course, on a server, you can have multiple virtual machines running, right? But basically, you own that computer or you rent it if you want, and you have to take care of everything which is around it, which means that for us as Microsoft, we give you the infrastructure as a service, which is why we often call this kind of computer the infrastructure as a service, IaaS. Now, when you create a new virtual machine on Azure, you can choose different operating systems, and it might surprise you to know that we support a large number of operating systems, not just Windows, but also things like Ubuntu, Red Hat. We have really a lot of Linux-based operating system, all kinds of things. And in fact, we run a lot of our infrastructure on these kind of things as well. We also have images, so if you, or you can create your own images, of course. So if you have basically a computer running and you want to kind of upload that to the web, you can do that to the cloud. And we have templates which allow you to get started very fast, for example, around, I don't know, AI or around data, etc., where you can create those machines very fast. So I'd like to show you a quick demo of a virtual machine running in Azure. And since we have Windows 11 in preview right now, maybe you don't want to install it on your computer immediately, but interestingly, you can do that in Azure, and then you can try everything that you always wanted to try with Windows 11 without, of course, any risks to your own infrastructure, because this is all running on Azure. And when you're done, you can just recycle this virtual machine. Let's take a look at the demo. For this first demo, I want to show you how you are going to create a new virtual machine in the Azure portal. And here I'm using the portal, but just know that most of what you see, you can do also with other tools. For example, everything you do in the portal, you can do it with our command line interaction, our CLI. And that runs, for example, on Bash if you're on Linux, or if you prefer Bash on Windows, in the command line, in a terminal, also, of course, in PowerShell. But we also have integration in some of our tools, such as Visual Studio Code, etc., etc. So here in the portal, I'm going to go and create a new resource. Notice that we have here tons of things that you can choose from, including also the documentation. So if you click on the Learn More, it's going to take you to our documentation at docs.microsoft.com. I'm looking specifically for a Windows 11 virtual machine because I want to try it out. And so here, as you see, I have search results. The first one is the one I want, the Windows 11 preview. And I'm going to create that with a set of configuration, which is really a low set of configuration. But again, I just want to try things out. So I need to put things in what we call a resource group. It's a group of resource. I need to give a name to my virtual machine. Here I just name it my VM11, and then after that I choose a region. And so here you see we talked about all the regions we had before, and you see the choice that you have. You also have availability options. For example, if you want redundancy, so that your machine, if it crashes at some point, you have a backup solution. And here you see the images we have. I mentioned that already before. You have tons of things such as also Linux, Windows Server, etc., etc. If you want to try things out. Then you're going to select a size, and here too you have a lot of choice, and of course you're going to pay more or less depending on what size you take. Notice that it's also possible to take a size and then to upgrade to another size later. We have huge virtual machines. In fact, here, notice that I'm looking for the biggest RAM quantity that we have. At the moment, it seems to be 11 terabytes, and that comes also with an 8 terabyte disk. So you have more RAM than disk, which is quite interesting. Of course, those are pretty expensive, but if you use them just from time to time, that can be actually a more interesting choice than going with a virtual machine or with a PC on your own premises. So now that we have created a machine, we can connect to it. And here I put it on my dashboard. The dashboard is a place where you can basically put links and shortcuts to your components and also put some graphs if you want to monitor the metrics. So this VM right now is not running, so I'm going to start it. I stopped it because I don't want to pay for it if I'm not using it. And in fact, when you stop your virtual machine, you only pay for storage, so it's quite interesting. While it is starting, we can take a look at things like availability and scaling. Here we have the inbound port rules that you can configure. Also, a very good tip, you can set auto shutdown. And this is really good if you want your machine to stop automatically every evening at a certain time so that you don't pay for times when you don't use it. Of course, everything is optional. You can set up a backup very easily, including some policies for backup frequency, etc., etc. And now let's go back to the overview because I think that the machine is running now, so I will connect to it. Notice that I can connect via SSH or remote desktop, RDP. This is what I will use now. So I'm going to download the RDP file. And then this is really just like when you connect to a computer, for example, at work, or if you have a computer running on your home network and you want to connect to it. I'm going to enter here my credentials, and once this is done, it's just going to essentially start the remote desktop client. And here we go, we have Windows 11. It looks pretty good. It's the first start, so of course it takes just a second to start, but here we are into Windows 11 and we can take a look at all the features. Now for the third demo, I want to show you something. It's a little bit of a gadget. It's a new phone that I have. I'm not going to name the brand, but if you're interested, you can just contact me on Twitter, I guess. And let me show you in this foldable phone with a very large screen, you can do some really cool thing. And really it means that I don't really need to take a laptop anymore because I have a VM. So let's go here into the portal in the web browser directly on the phone. I'm using Edge. I'm going to connect just like I did before, download the RDP file, and this is going to start the RDP client, which is on my phone, which is running natively on my phone. Okay, so let me enter username and password. All right, this is done. It's going to connect, and I have here Windows 11 running on my foldable phone. This is pretty cool. But even better, one thing I can do, which is really cool, is that I can connect this phone to an external monitor and to an external keyboard and a mouse via Bluetooth, and it's connecting to the monitor via USB-C and HDMI. And here you see the beautiful display running on my external monitor. And same thing as before, I can do just what I did before. I'm going to connect to the portal. I'm going to check if the machine is running. From here, I can also manage my virtual machines and everything. Let's connect to that. Download the RDP file. Essentially, it's exactly the same as before, except that now I have really a large screen. It's a full HD screen in that case, and that's going to allow me to basically do my work on Windows 11, even though I'm running this on a phone. So you see that it really opens possibilities that were really science fiction not long ago. Now that we talked about infrastructure as a service, IaaS, and virtual machines, very often the next step that people take is basically they want to get rid of the infrastructure worries. They want to delegate that to the cloud provider, in this case Microsoft. And a good way to do that is to move to a different model, which is platform as a service. Platform as a service, you know, it encompasses really a lot of services. For example, app service, this is like a web server in the cloud, but also things like data or cognitive services, etc. So let's talk a little bit more about app services. This is one of my favorite services on Azure. It allows you to run all kinds of things, for example, web apps, mobile applications, but also API applications, of course. And it is quite powerful in the sense that you have to just worry a little bit about the configuration. When you create it, you can choose an operating system which is going to run the server, for example, Linux or Windows. And this is really cool because since now .NET, which is my favorite platform, platform actually runs on Linux. It means that I can develop on Windows and then publish my application in production to Linux, which is very powerful. You also have different platforms, .NET, Java, Node.js, PHP, Python, etc. And things like, for example, auto-scaling. I'll show you that in the demo. Integration with other applications, so you can really componentize your application and then have those applications communicate together. Continuous deployment is, of course, supported from GitHub or from Azure DevOps, so you can choose. This is really cool. But what would be an application without data? And here too, we got you covered because we have tons of data solutions on Azure. For example, of course, SQL database, SQL managed instance. This is kind of a lift and shift, all right? For everybody who is used to SQL, they can easily migrate to a platform, a database as a service in the cloud using SQL. But we also have other solutions. Azure Tables, right? This is in storage. This is very easy to use, super easy to store your objects as data. It's not so powerful, but if you want more power, then you can also go to Cosmos DB, which is our very, very powerful NoSQL service. It's globally distributed. It's available everywhere we have Azure. In fact, a lot of Azure actually and a lot of Microsoft really actually works on Cosmos. And it's also a multi-model service, which means that you can choose to, for example, if you have a MongoDB locally, you can easily migrate it and continue to run your Mongo APIs in Cosmos DB instead. Or you can run SQL, you can run different models like that. So it's quite convenient. We also have open source databases. So if you love those open source databases, and we do at Microsoft, in fact, we also contribute to the development of some of those, such as Postgres. Then you can also run them as a service. For example, PostgreSQL, MySQL, MariaDB on Azure database, very convenient. And then you have all the advantages of the open source database, but also the advantages of the cloud. And finally, if you have big data, and you know that nowadays everybody's collecting data, you can easily store this data in data lakes, in data warehouses, and then you can run analytics. You can also run all kinds of ingestions pipeline where you clean your data as you ingest it, etc. What would be Azure without storage? It's probably the most used service that we have. Storage can be blobs, binary large objects. Is just basically a file or something that you put in the cloud. We have also an actual file system that you can access via SMB, which is a protocol that you can use in Linux, in Windows Explorer, or in Mac to access your files. We have queues if you want to have messages and have services communicate together. That can be useful. We have tables. I mentioned that before, very simple and easy to use database. And we have, of course, disks, because when you do a VM, you need a disk, but sometimes you can also create a disk for other services. Now, all this runs on a unified store system, a unified infrastructure, and everything is accessible via REST APIs. And of course, we have, you would think so, SDKs for .NET, for Java, for JavaScript, etc. So very, very convenient and powerful. So let's see a demo of platform service, of PaaS. And for this demo, I would like to take you on one of my web servers and show you how monitoring and metrics can really help you to keep an eye on your server. So let's take a look at the demo here. For the next demo, I would like to show you a web server which is running as an app service on Azure. And here you see that you have some monitoring. And let's take a little bit of a deep dive into that, because this is one of the huge advantages of running on Azure, is that you have all this monitoring going on, which is super easy to set up. In fact, it's as easy as checking a checkbox when you start. So let's take a look at that. It's called Application Insights. And here you see that I have some graphs. So let's increase a little bit the duration so that we can see what happened. And I see that I have some failed requests on my website, which is a little bit concerning because you want to present, of course, a good user experience. But interestingly, if I check those URLs, those are very old URLs. Some of them are from 2006, 2007. And I'd love to understand better who is clicking there. And this is something that I can do using, for example, Refer, etc. So I will dive in the logs at some point. But I see a another thing which is annoying me a little bit is those thread abort exceptions. And let's dive a little bit better to see what happens. This seems to be happening when I use my link shortener, which is running at gslb.ch. Cool thing is that I have really access to the call stack, and that allows me to debug. So at some point I will have to dive into that and understand a little bit better what are those errors. I have a lot of helper components to do that. For example, the application map, it's not set up here, but it's going to show you all the components of your application and their interaction. Very interesting also the live metrics. If you have a production website, you want to observe that. And so here, notice that I just pinged my website once, I just loaded it on my phone, and here you see the single request which is coming up. Right now it's very quiet, but very interesting to observe that because this is going to give you tons of information and metrics about your web application. Let's go back to the top and see some of the services that we have around app services. So for example, of course, you have the configuration, authentication, identity, so that your app service can also access other services. You can scale up to a better plan if you want, and you can also scale out, which means that we are going to add servers to respond to a demand, either manually like here or using some auto scale. For example, you say, well, when the processor, the CPU reaches 50% or more, I want to add an instance of server to my setup. And of course, you're going to pay accordingly. You can manage everything such as, for example, custom domain, also TLS SSL settings for your HTTPS. Basically, everything can be managed here in the portal, either in the Azure portal on the web or via command line integration. Another service I really love on Azure is cognitive services. This is essentially artificial intelligence for people who are not data scientists, for example, developers like me. And here you have a lot of APIs, and we are going to allow you to take services, to use services, for example, in decision making, language, speech, vision, all right? And here, right in the portal, in the cognitive service portal, you can already do some trials and do some tests. And for example, let's take a look here at the face APIs. This is an API that allows you to detect, for example, a person's age or maybe their emotion, if they are happy or not. And one of the things we have here is face verification. You can check the likelihood that two faces belong to the same person. So for example, if I check here this, middle-aged white guy, which I believe looks a little bit like me, you see that here, this is the same person, right? The confidence is at 0.91. But now let's take a look at somebody else, and in that case I'm going to upload my own picture and see the likelihood of me being that person. And of course now we see the confidence is very low, 0.08, and it means that very likely that I'm not that person. So this is only one of the multiple services that we have, face verification, but we also have emotion detection, we have speech recognition, we have text to speech or speech to text also. We use those, for example, to caption videos and make them more inclusive, etc., etc., etc. And this is all available via APIs, REST APIs, or via some SDKs that you can use in .NET, in Java, in JavaScript, and more. So take a look at those, and this kind of rounds up the presentation of Platform as a Service. Of course, we have way more things than that, but hopefully you will try it out and see if you like those components and compose your own application. So let's talk about serverless now, because when you have gone from a virtual machine with all the infrastructure to Platform as a Service, when you have some of the infrastructure, very often you want to go even further and go, for example, to Azure Function, where you don't have to worry as much about the infrastructure as, for example, for an app service or for a SQL database. And I really love Azure Function. In fact, you see that I'm wearing the t-shirt today. So it's a great service that we have on Azure, and something that is really going to help you try things out and deploy new production applications very fast without having to worry about maintaining those. And this is really the power of serverless here. Like I said, no infrastructure headache, right? Yes, of course, this is all running on the server, but you never have to handle the server. Essentially, when you create your function application, you say, all right, I want to have a Linux server or a Windows server, and that's pretty much it. And then you put some monitoring around it, so you get logs and messages, and you can see how it's running. But essentially, the rest of the step is just you trying your code locally on your machine, pushing that code very often via DevOps, via GitHub Actions or Azure DevOps to your Azure function, and then it's just going to run on its own. It is started on demand when you have a trigger happening. We'll talk about that in the demo. But it's also going to scale on demand. And this is really powerful because imagine that you want to have a system which is handling one file. Okay, and then imagine that suddenly you have 1,000 files. Well, no problem. We are going to give you 1,000 functions, and then you can start them in parallel. You can wait for the result, and then continue the execution of your program. Or if you have suddenly 1 million files, no problem. We are going to give you those 1 million instances of functions. And because you pay only for what you actually use, it's also very efficient and very cost-effective to do that. We also have a generous free tier when you can run millions of executions of functions for free. So it is really quite nice. You're going to start paying when you're using those functions really a lot, but typically this is when you start also making money as an enterprise, and so it's only fair that you start paying for that. But really, when you develop and later also when you run functions at a lower scale, then no problem at all. This is probably going to be free for you. So this is really cool. Functions are very powerful. We also have a lot of other serverless services, things like Azure Signalr services, which allows you to have a Signalr hub in the cloud and to distribute your event in real time. So this is going to basically react to something you say to Signalr A, send a message to all the subscribers, and then the subscription message happens via WebSocket, so it's extremely fast and extremely convenient. We have also other things like Logic Apps. Logic App is a workflow-based application development framework, if you want, very similar to Power Apps, and I'm going to show you a demo a little bit later. So without further ado, let's take a look at the demo. In here, I want to show you how I'm going to create a serverless function application very easily in the Azure portal, and then we'll also take a quick look at a Logic App so that you can see how this workflow-based development works. For this next demo, I want to show you how I create a new Azure Function application in the web portal. And I'm also going to code directly in the portal, which is not something that we do typically, but that can be useful to try things out, all right? So let's add this to the resource group. And I'm also going to give a name. And of course, this name needs to be unique because it's going to be a URL at the end, all right? I'm going to use .NET, but we have tons of other platforms that you can use here. And I'm going to place it in Western Europe, which is where I am. Here we have, for example, the choice of the operating system. You can put your functions on Linux, even if they run on .NET. And finally, it's a consumption model, meaning that I pay as I go. I can monitor my Azure function just like I monitor an app service. Here, I'm not going to do that because it's a simple demo, but you can really have all the metrics that I showed you earlier on in the app service for your Azure function as well. So now the deployment is taking place. I'm speeding things up a little bit because I don't want to lose time in the video. But essentially, after really less than a minute, typically, my resource is ready and I can go to the resource. Now, this is just a function application at this time. Nothing is happening here, but I can also go and create a function. So let's go to the Functions tab, and I'm going to create a new function. And when I create a function, I need to select a trigger, which is what is going to start the function. So first of all, I'm going to say I want to develop in the portal, which again, we don't really do in production. We have other tools, Visual Studio Code, or any terminal, really. Here you have all the triggers that are going to start your function. So I'm going to take an HTTP trigger, meaning that I'm basically exposing this function to internet, okay? And then I'm going to give it a name, and I'm going to set this function to anonymous because again, this is a simple demo, meaning that anybody can call this function if they want. Let's go and create that. It's going to take a few seconds to spin everything. And then it's going to show me the code directly in the portal, which again, I think it's the third time I'm saying that, we don't do typically. Normally you develop in Visual Studio Code or in Visual Studio or with a terminal. But here, for the demo, let me show you the code. So my function is going to react to a request. It's going to extract a name parameter, and I'm going to go and modify the code directly here in the web browser. I say hello from Switzerland, and then the name, all right? I'm going to save, and because I saved, everything is already deployed on the server. It's a serverless solution. I don't have to worry about that. Let's go and get the URL of this particular endpoint. And if I go into the web browser and put this URL, if I don't put the name, the function works, but it tells me, please give me a name, all right? And then after that, if I add the name, for example, here in the query string, then it's going to react properly and tell me, hello from Switzerland, Laurent. So this is a very, very quick spinning up a function and making it run, but hopefully it shows you a little bit the possibilities that you have. We have so many more triggers, such as HTTP, such as timer trigger if you want to run, on a recurrence mechanism, on a schedule, or we also have things like event grid, like reacting to events from other services in Azure, and like this you can compose your services. Now for this demo here, I want to show you a logic app. This is a logic app that I used when I gave a presentation, and then I wanted to automatically send some reminders to people. So the way that I did that, I said, all right, I'm going to add a blob into Azure, into storage, and this blob is going to be in JSON format, and this is basically all the people who subscribe to my presentation. I'm going to here have a condition, and I say, all right, if the blobs that change is named registrations.json, then I want to do something, and you see you have code without having code, really. I want to basically get the content of the JSON. I'm going to then parse it. So here is the schema of the JSON. And then for each one of my subscriber, here you have the for each loop. I'm going to send an email via Outlook. And here the cool thing is that I don't have to handle the authentication into Outlook because the Logic app is doing that for me. And of course, it's very convenient because authenticating in code is something which is quite complicated. So here, Logic app is taking care of that for me. Now, this is only an example. We use Logic apps a lot every day at Microsoft to handle, annoying part of our job, I would say, to automate that. And really, I can recommend you to check it out. So in the beginning of this presentation, I told you that using Azure, it's very easy to compose different services to create a full stack application. And here I have an example. It's my Timekeeper application. It's a utility we use at Microsoft when we do live shows to keep track of time. And so here, this is composed of multiple services. For example, here I have a function application, and you can see here the application inside data, which is going to allow me to keep track of metrics and of logs, of course. I also have another component, which is a key vault, and this is going to help me to take care of all my secrets and basically make sure that only I have access to those secrets or only an admin have access to that. But then all the applications can access those via APIs. Then I also have a Signalr service. This is a real-time distributed event hub, which is sending events via WebSockets to my web applications. And here I have a static web app. This is the client part of the application. Static web app is awesome. Here I'm running with a Blazor application, so a .NET application, but you can also host a JavaScript application. You see that you have role management, you have different environments if you want to have staging and production. You can manage your custom domains directly here. You can also have functions, for example, private functions, which are accessible only to certain roles. And also here you see that you have different plans. So this allows me to show you here a quick demo of Timekeeper. And Timekeeper is essentially, like I said, the timekeeping solution that we use at Microsoft. You see that I have a possibility to log in. The login is handled by GitHub, Twitter, or other systems. This is all managed by the static web application. Creating new sessions. Those sessions will be saved into Azure storage. So there is also some persistence. We can edit the clocks, etc. Everything is saved via Azure Function into storage again. And of course, I could use a database if I prefer that. You have different features such as, for example, showing colors when the timer is reaching the end of the presentation so that the speaker knows when they need to stop talking, etc., etc. So you have really tons of functionalities. And here, this is the host view that you are seeing. So this is a view which is protected by a login. But after that, when you have different clocks prepared, then your guests can log in and anybody can be a guest. And the cool thing is that it works here in a web browser. So I'm using in-private browsing to kind of simulate a guest on a different machine. Those guests can be really literally on any machine. I can start my clocks. And like this allows me to tell my guests, well, you know, when the clock reaches, 1 minute or 30 seconds, then maybe it's time to think about stopping to talk and giving the word back to the host. And you can also send different prompts and messages. So essentially, it's a little bit like, if you want, like, teleprompter application, all right? So here we see what happens if the user is going over time. So like this, we have a silent way to communicate. And of course, because it's a Blazor application, it could be also any SPA application, single page application. It runs on mobile as well, as you can see. So any number of guests can be. It's also going to scale very nicely, right? So if I have really a lot of guests, then no problem. My systems are able to scale and to handle that. Though, of course, in a normal scenario, we only have a few guests, so it's not too bad. We also support multiple hosts, so we can have 2 or more people actually managing a session, which is really nice if one of the hosts crashes and has to restart his machines and another host can take over. Everything is preserved because everything is running in the cloud, and when the client connects, he gets the state and everything. So thank you so much for watching the Timekeeper demo. If you're interested to know more about Timekeeper, just go to timekeeper.cloud, and then if you click the About button, you will see the full version of the tutorial as well as more information. And finally, also check the GitHub, right? Because this is an open source project and all the code is public there. We are at the end of this presentation. I hope it was useful for you, and most especially, I hope that it removed some of the fears that you may have when you hear about Azure, because it's a little bit overwhelming, and I've been there before. I know how many of those services we have, I know how many features we have, and it can be a little bit scary. But really, don't hesitate to try things out, and if you go to Microsoft Learn, I'll give you a link later, you can try things out for free and without really any risk. In this presentation, we talked about a small introduction to Azure and to the concept of data centers and regions. And then after that, we talked about infrastructure as a service, virtual machines, which is very often where people get started to go in the cloud. We also have containers. I didn't talk about that, but really take a look at that because it's fascinating if you want to package your application and put it in the cloud fast and easily. Then we talked about platform as a service. If you don't want to worry about your infrastructure so much, this is a great place to go as well. Things like app services, web server in the cloud, or data solutions such as SQL database, such as Cosmos DB if you like NoSQL, etc. And finally, we talked about serverless solutions such as Azure Functions, but also Logic App for a low-code or no-code solution. And we saw lots of demos. Now, if you didn't catch something, if I went too fast on something, this can happen. Make sure to check the video again. And you can also go and check the slides at the link at the bottom here. Or if you scan this QR code, this is also where you can get access to the slides. You can also get in touch with me. I'm Bugnion on Twitter. And finally, I want to talk to you about Microsoft Learn. This is where you can try things out without any risks and for free. If you go to this link, the one that says 592, then you can have access to the Microsoft Azure Fundamentals Learning Pass. This is a place where we prepare you to the certification. But even if you don't want to get certified, you can take all those modules anyway. Sometimes it's also a good refresher. You can try things out in Sandbox. So basically there is no risk and it's not going to cost you anything. You don't even need a Microsoft Azure account for most of those modules, so you can really try things out very easily. I want to thank you again so much for watching. My name is Laurent Bugnion. I work for Microsoft, and it was a real pleasure to give you this introduction to Microsoft Azure today. Thank you.